my decision to return to the United States was crystallized when sitting at a milk bar, which was a kind of a corner luncheonette in a rather low-rent area of Sydney. I overheard a couple of medical students talking about they'd give their right arm to be able to visit and practice medicine in the United States. And I was thinking, not particularly happy with the situation we were in, and not as appreciated as I had hoped, and working extremely hard. Wow, I have a license to practice medicine in the United States. I think we ought to go back. And by this point, Doris, my wife, was very eager to return. We're 10,000 miles away from family, and we have a little grandson that none of the grandparents were able to see. And so the decision was made a lot easier, and by October, Doris was heading back, and I was there to decide one way or the other whether we were going to remain or stay. She would leave the choice up to me, but she would begin to look for a place to stay. And I was on the verge of accepting the position of editor of the New York State Journal of Medicine in Lake Success, New York. That decision was made easier when I felt that things were becoming even worse than they had been, and the mercenary board of the publishing company was interested in looking for more pharmaceutical advertising, and I was told I would be asked to edit the Australian Prescriber, which was a Commonwealth government publication to evaluate drugs, sort of like the American Medical Letter published in America since the early 60s after the Kefauver hearings on medications and their regulation. And it really was a hurtful decision. I mean, it hurt me to have to resign and issue a long and rather scathing editor's report. I had been hoping to stay for 3 to 5 years. Instead, we wound up staying 1 year. And when I returned to New York, I was going to a journal that hadn't really been visible to anybody in many years. It was edited by a brilliant former pathologist, Al Angrist, who was a legend in pathology, but who had clearly done the journal more in retirement and not with the kind of in-depth passion that it takes to start attracting interest. I mean, I think the journal was decent enough. It had case reports and the business of the medical society, and the budgets were sufficient to keep producing this thing, but you got the sense that nobody read this journal anymore. And indeed, when I arrived, a whole stack of articles that had been accepted were there, and they were pretty awful. One was by a guy named William Ober on sadomasochism and autoasphyxiation. I mean, it was graphic to the point of obscene, and it wasn't really very good either, but it went on and on and on for pages, and I informed him that this wasn't going to be published in the New York State Journal of Medicine under my editorship. And it took a long time to get the journal back. Dr. Angrist was a wonderful man. I enjoyed, he was impish and lovely and gracious, but clearly losing some of his faculties, and he did pass away early, I believe, in the second year that I was there. And I was up in upstate at the time and didn't have a chance to go to his service, but I greatly admire him and heard a lot of wonderful things about him, and his residents still had a dinner in his honor every year. But my relationship with the medical society was never extremely good. They had committed to resurrecting the journal. At least that's what I heard from the executive vice president that hired me. Of course, he then announced not long after I arrived that he would be retiring, and a new fellow came aboard, a guy named Milt Rosenberg, who was an obstetrician and now was going to be head of the medical society, a real medical politician. Very humorous fellow, very engaging, very intense, and he was skeptical of the journal, especially when I announced that I was going to have to pretty much shut it down for a couple of months until we were able to produce the kind of quality that we needed to, and that would be the debut of the journal in December 19 1983, the first theme issue on tobacco. And it was not a good time because they were wondering, why isn't this journal being published? And that's what we brought you here. But when the journal hit the stands, it was so well received that I knew that we had a hit, and that the letters just poured in, and it looked like it was going to be a wonderful opportunity. I remember getting called by a reporter from the Baltimore Sun on a story on smoking, and she just had to add that, I interview a lot of people, but I very seldom get a chance to talk to someone who really is passionate about his job and loves what he does. And so I was really appreciative for that comment, and that's the way I felt. Things went well for a while. But I hired I had an opportunity to hire a deputy, as I had done in Australia. In this instance, I needed someone to help with reviews, to try to pep up the book review section. And I'd come across an editorial that had been written in the journal by an individual named Pascal Imperato. I knew nothing about him, but I gathered in reading this editorial about how we must remain in New York in the poor areas and fight to help these people and be real advocates for them. I thought I detected someone who really cared. It turns out he had been a former health commissioner of New York City under Abraham Beame and was chairman of the Department of Preventive Medicine at Downstate Medical School, which was where my father went to medical school. What could be better than that? So I called him up and I said, would you like to meet and consider maybe joining the journal, a one-day-a-week position? And he was very gracious. We met. Looked like it was going to work out just fine. And along the way, I would go to his department once or twice. I probably went maybe 4 times in the 3 years that, or less than 3 years that I knew him. And he would come in one day and handle the book reviews and handle some of the reviews, but we didn't really have very much to talk about. But in driving with him once, I did get some clues about him. He had some very pejorative things to say about different ethnic groups, and while driving, he would spout out epithets. Must have been a certain ethnic group that was driving that badly, and didn't refer to them in the way that you would expect someone to. And then he did let on that he really was hoping that he would get a second position that would earn him additional funds so that he could keep up with his house in Manhasset. And he really seemed to be disappointed in his lot and not having earned enough and so forth. I should have picked up on that because after the second theme issue on smoking came out in August, in the early part of August 1985, I noticed that things were changing. The managing editor I had was barely speaking to me, but she was extremely friendly to Imperato when he would come in. And it was just a not a great environment. And I walked in one day, and this is in spite of the fact that the Medical Society Congress of Delegates voted a special resolution commending me on having resurrected the journal and brought it not only state attention but national attention through the theme issues on smoking. And I walked in a day or two after Christmas, this 1985, and had a message that the vice president wanted to talk to me right then and there. Now, Milt Rosenberg had passed away suddenly earlier that year at his desk. It was rather tragic and caught the society well unaware. And they named as an interim executive vice president an old hand who'd been in a sinecure after having been an obstetrician in Flushing, New York for many years, a guy named George Lawrence, who was an AMA insider and who once told me that his greatest hero was a guy called Joe Miller at the AMA, who no one ever saw at the AMA, was always behind the scenes and was the backbone for James Salmon, the big powerhouse at the AMA, who ran it with an iron fist and brought the AMA back to life after they'd almost gone bankrupt in the 1970s. But he was a dictator, and Joe Miller was the guy always calling all the shots and pulling all the strings. And this was Lawrence's most admired figure, a very shadowy figure, all politician. And Lawrence and I initially had some social connections. He said he knew my father from the Queens County Medical Society and seemed to be nice. And this lasted all of a couple of weeks, and I realized this guy was, well, first and foremost, an inebriate. He would go out for lengthy lunches and also didn't seem very stable and was just not a nice guy. And indeed, when the medical society went smoke-free after I'd been lobbying for this for almost the whole time I was there, the memo was sent out to the staff of the society that they were going to go smoke-free, but that was only because the fire marshals had informed them that they could be cited for and they could be fined if they did not. It had nothing to do with the fact that I'd been lobbying for this for a couple of years. But I went up to Lawrence's office, and I immediately walked in, and he said, well, I've decided to hire a different editor, and so I'm letting you go. And that was the way I was informed. And I was in shock. I was absolutely apoplectic. I'm sorry, I don't understand. What do you mean? Yeah, well, I don't like the way you're running the journal, so I'm letting you go. And all the board agrees with me, and I've checked it with them. So get your things and get out. And that's all he wanted to talk. I was stammered, but why is this? It's, I don't like. You got a very messy office. I don't like the way you run your journal. Not at all nice. Very nasty. Not, by the way, you did fine, but we're going in a different direction. And I said, but I didn't really know what to ask. I said, but I've got a new house. My wife is pregnant. And he just said, basically, this is it. I said, but on the way out, may I know the name of my successor? He says, yes, I've asked Dr. Imperato to step in. Well, after being in shock, although that night we had a very interesting, pleasant time going to see the film White Knight, and really enjoyed it. And it was, I suppose you could say, in retrospect, some vague sense of relief being out of this place where I'd often described the average age of the board as deceased. I was by far maybe 20 years younger than the next youngest official in the society. And I simply was in shock. I had no idea what to do. My boards, I was coming up for that, but I'd already passed the deadline for registering, so I was in danger of losing my certification boards. But more importantly, I hadn't seen a patient in 5 years because I'd been editing. And I also, Doris was pregnant. We had 2 boys and a new house and a mortgage. And it was truly an awful time. And I at first I didn't catch on, and I contacted Imperato, and I said, but what's going on here? What you didn't tell me? Why did? He says, oh, Alan, you should have seen the signals. Almost really blaming me, and that I should have known that I was not in good graces there, and that I should have been looking around for. Well, of course, the story is that he'd been trying to get that job almost from the day he arrived, and he had convinced Lawrence that he could do the same thing in a half-time position, so he could retain his chairmanship, as I was as a full-time editor. And about a month later, I guess the one consolation was that once the word got out, about 40 people wrote letters, irate letters. Dr. Coop, Ron Davis, Mike Cummings at the time from Roswell Park, Kenneth Warner, Judith Mackay, the editors of the British Medical Journal and the Lancet. And of course, they eventually had to get a form letter saying, oh, this had nothing to do with his stance on smoking. And to go even further, Imperato started cooking up another theme issue on smoking, which I had already begun. I'd already sent out about 40 letters to potential authors, and he got a hold of those letters and wrote to them and acted as if there was nothing that had happened. Fortunately, people like Mike Cummings and, people like Bill Cahan and Ken Warner and Judith Mackay and several others wrote letters back to Imperato saying this is not an appropriate request. And with Dr. Blum being gone from the journal, we have no interest. Greg Connolly also, we have no interest in writing for your journal. So he would fire back and say, oh, that his leaving had nothing to do with his stance on smoking. And they wound up publishing a little dinky issue with some of the contributors who had never obviously gotten the word from me. I didn't know all 40 of them because I didn't have access to those letters. And some of them simply sent in letters so Imperato could be said to have published a theme issue, which had virtually no illustrations, and it was just clearly something to cover up why they had let me go. But as they say, as one door closes, another one opens. And along the way in that first month, I wound up taking my LSATs. I thought I might try law school. Mike Cummings was able to get me a job interview at Roswell Park in the Department of Preventive Medicine at the University of Buffalo. Saxton Graham, who was the well-known chairman, and I would look good. I would go up and I would be a member of the faculty, and I would teach a course on cancer. And when I boarded the plane to get back to New York from Buffalo, Saxton Graham said, "Just think about it. Don't make up your mind overnight." I was just so thrilled. It really was just barely a month after I'd been fired, and here it was, somebody really wanting me to step into a new role, a new city, fresh start. And I waited, and a few days later I got a call from Saxton Graham as I was thinking about the job, and he said, "Just wanted you to know we've decided to go in another direction, and I've hired somebody," who turned out to be somebody from the American Cancer Society who'd never taught anything. And I was pretty upset at that. But Mike got the word, too, to the chairman of family medicine, who contacted me and said, "How come you didn't tell me you were up here? We'd love to have you come up and interview for a job with our department." And that proved to be probably the most disastrous visit I've ever had. This fellow turned out to be an inebriate. He disappeared after he met me. I could never find him again. He had a known alcohol problem, and his faculty were really not at all on the same page. I went to lunch with them, and one of them kept asking me, "Well, you haven't delivered a baby in 8 years, or I guess by that point it was only 4 years or 5 years. How come you think you can just come back and deliver babies?" I said, "Well, I think this is what I can retrain to do. I'm not that far." "Well, how do you know you can do it?" And he kept badgering me. And I finally just looked at him and stopped. I said, "I don't know why you keep asking the same question and what you have against me, but this just isn't appropriate." And that was the way the whole interview ran. There were a couple of wonderful people there, but that was not in the cards as well. So this was a very, very, very tough year. And one of the places I contacted was the American Public Health Association's Bill Foege, who had been the director of the Centers for Disease Control and who had invited me to give the inaugural speech when he became head of the American Public Health Association in the mid-1980s, and who coined the term the gray plague, the brown plague, to talk about smoking and tobacco. And Bill was very interested and saddened to hear that I'd been fired at the New York State Journal of Medicine, and he said maybe he could look into something for me in Washington, and he wanted to know the circumstances. And I told him about this deputy editor who connived to get my job. He said, "Who was that?" And I said, "It was Pat Imparato." And he said, "Imparato?" He said, "Obviously, you must not have known about the plagiarism case." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Oh, yeah, we were informed, ironically, by a reviewer for the New York State Journal of Medicine quite a few years ago when the reviewer was sent a book to review on infectious diseases. I believe it was called the Control of Infectious Diseases of Man, that this was a virtual plagiarism of the American Public Health Association's standard handbook on infectious disease called the Control of Communicable Diseases of Man by Abe Benenson. And it was in maybe its 15th or 20th edition by this point. And it was the standard handbook of about 400 pages on all infectious diseases. Well, it seemed that Imparato had gone to Mali at some point in his world and his career and served in some international capacity for a year or so and taken lots of pictures of tropical diseases and also brought home a lot of artwork that he then donated to a museum in Kansas. And I don't know, to me, I have no idea what that was all about, because there was a question of how people were getting artwork back from Africa. But in any event, I was astounded. I said, what do you mean plagiarism? Well, it's a long story, and I'll have to get Bill Macbeth, who's the head of the American Public Health Association, to tell you about it. And I wrote to Macbeth, and I said, I understand that there was a plagiarism case. And Macbeth wrote back that he would look into it, and yes, this is true, but that he couldn't really talk about it. Well, it took more than a year. And by that time, I had landed a job at Baylor College of Medicine. But when I opened up and read the front page of a New York Times one morning and learned that a a chairman of psychiatry at Harvard, a fellow I believe named Shavard Frazier, was being outed on the front page of the New York Times for having apparently plagiarized 12 paragraphs from an article in Scientific American some years earlier, a finding that was noted by a graduate student at the University of Rochester, that this was important enough to make the front page of the New York Times. Well, by then I had gotten a hold of the books in question, The Control of Communicable Diseases of Man by Benenson and The Control of Infectious Diseases by Imperato, published by a publisher named Charles C. Thomas. And they literally were verbatim plagiarism. It was unbelievable. You'd read, this condition is comprised of A, B, and C, and Imperato's book would say this condition is comprised of B, C, and A. He literally just reversed the sentences, and the exact same content was there. He added nothing except for some photographs. And it just, I had never seen anything like it, neither before nor since. And I got finally the letter from the APHA, and the lawyer who had handled this case had gone out to his garage and had dug up the papers that described what had happened. And it seemed that when they were informed that the books were virtually identical, they sought to take legal action against Imperato. But once the lawyers started looking at the case, they reminded the APHA of several things. First, that plagiarism is not a legal offense unless, that is, you can prove monetary damages. And because the Charles C. Thomas publisher's book by Imperato was over $20 and the Handbook of Communicable Diseases by Benenson was only around $5, they couldn't show that anybody in his right mind would have purchased the $20 book and thus caused some kind of damage to the American Public Health Association. So in the inability to prove monetary damages, all that the APHA could do was allege that the books were taken, that the author took all the content, but then that too might be subject to question because this was an open book, that was a question of whether this was a kind of everyman's copyright that anyone could use. And also, if this became a question of the integrity of the alleged plagiarist, that individual could then sue for defamation. And since the individual who would be sued in question was using his cousin as his lawyer and who thus had no legal expenses, the recommendation of the lawyer was to settle this in such a way that all they could do was demand that the books by Imperato that were already sold and on the shelves, that the unsold books would be withdrawn from the market, but that the books that were already sold and on the shelves would remain. And that's how I was able to track down both of these books, not only on through booksellers, but also going to the library at the University of Texas School of Public Health. I really was astounded, and I wrote immediately to Larry Altman, who was the medical writer of the New York Times, who wrote up this story about Shavard Frazier's plagiarism at the hospital in Boston, and who incidentally was basically demoted for this. His chairmanship ended, and I believe he was forced to take a leave as a result of this expose of his plagiarism of the 12 paragraphs of this article. And I guess you could argue that when there's one plagiarism, there's probably going to be more plagiarisms. And I do know that Imperato, in writing his book on relative risk, did use and refer to some of my own material on smoking. And it was not clear what he was borrowing from me. He did mention me in his acknowledgments, but it was unclear that he was taking sections of my writings without attribution. But I wrote to Altman and I said, if you think a 12-paragraph plagiarism is big enough to run on the front page, you won't believe the plagiarism I have for you. And he said, what is it? And I said, well, it's an almost duplicate version of The Control of Communicable Diseases of Man by Benenson, by the APHA, by another individual, and it's almost a verbatim plagiarism. He said, well, who was it? And I said, Pat Imperato. He says, oh, I know Pat. It couldn't be. Well, I sent him the books, and he called me back immediately and said, I can't believe this. This is absolutely unbelievable. But he said, I'm about to take a trip. I don't think I can touch this. It's just that big. I wrote then to a fellow who wrote a column in the New England Journal of Medicine, John Iglehart, who was also floored by this, and for whatever reason said that he too would not write about it, but he was astounded by it. And then I contacted Paul Rayburn of the Associated Press, who was also amazed. And Rayburn said, this sounds like a great story. He himself did contact Imperato. He did do his homework. He did write up the story. And 15 minutes before it was going to run over the Associated Press wire, the story was killed. And that's really what happened to it. Nothing has ever been said publicly about this. No court has ever considered this. The book still exists on the shelves of a number of libraries. And I did see an article not that many years ago in San Francisco Magazine, when I happened to be there, on a writer from the New York Times having been exposed as having been a serial plagiarist. He was a Native American writer, Charlie, I forget the last name, but the article was all about plagiarism and pointing out that given the Jason Blair case, where stories were just made up, and a Janet Malcolm case the Janet, I forget her last name, in the Washington Post, who got a Pulitzer Prize for what turned out to be a made-up story, that given these, that should plagiarism be tolerated and should made-up stories be tolerated? And but I think the conclusion of the story was, after all, who got hurt by it? So that impelled me to write the letter to San Francisco Magazine saying, if anyone thinks that plagiarism is a victimless crime, then they only have to think of me, because I lost my job thanks to someone who was alleged to have committed plagiarism and who was never called out on it publicly. And the agreement that the APHA did make with the Charles C. Thomas Publishers was sealed away. And not until I had asked Bill Macbeth to try to tell me what happened, and he'd gotten a hold of the lawyer who did write this lengthy letter defending their decision not to do a lawsuit, but to settle out of court and seal it, and not even to inform their own membership, did this story ever get out. And that's where it is today. And the good news is that I was able to go back to clinical medicine. I know that one of the most disappointing moments when I called Dr. Kurt Duschel, who was chair of community medicine at Mount Sinai College of Medicine, where I had just spoken just a few weeks before I was fired. He'd had me come and speak to his students, and I thought he was very enamored of my work and really was pleased with my talk. But when I called him, the first thing he said when I told him I'd been fired and was rather upset and looking for a way to get land in a new position, he said to me, "It's your own damn fault." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, you've gotten too far away from patients." He says, "You should never do that again." And that was really the most wonderful advice that I got. I valued it, and I was very fortunate to land a role at Baylor College of Medicine with Bob Rakel. Bob heard about me through Sam Nixon, an old friend from the academy, who knew Nick Pisacano, who was the president of the American Board of Family Medicine, who, when I called him after having missed the deadline to recertify and take the exam, said, "Alan, don't worry, I'll get you through this. We'll get you enrolled. You take a review course, you sit and you study, and we'll get you through." And thanks to his encouragement, and even the encouragement of running into somebody from the University of Buffalo that I saw when I took the exam in New Jersey, and she said, "How are you? We were all so sorry you didn't come and join us." I thought that was so nice, and that was a real encouraging thing to sit an exam with. And I passed my exam, and then when I was called by Bob Rakel to come down to Houston to interview for a position there, it really was a nice meeting. And while I was in Houston for this interview in August of, actually I think it was earlier than that, of 1986, I opened up the Houston papers, and there was the headline, "Smoking Ban Ordinance Hearing Today in City Council." And I don't know if anybody ever done this on a job interview, but I said to Bob Rakel, I wondered if I could just alter my schedule a little bit and go down to hear the city council discussing smoking. And it was on the front page of today's paper, and he kindly let me do this. And that's where I met Ross Bannister, head of the Lung Association, and became good friends with him. And it was a great opportunity to meet the people who were involved in just getting started on banning smoking in public places in Houston. Well, I was invited back for a second interview, and a couple of months later, and of all the coincidences, when I got down, I saw the newspapers. The front page headline said, "Final hearing on smoking ban in City Council today." And Rakel laughed when I said, "You won't believe this, but they're having the final hearing. Do you think I could get down there?" And he again kindly let me do that. And I met DeBakey, who was testifying, and I met other people. And it was just a meeting of the minds. It was a wonderful time. It was a great interview. I did get offered the job. And as I was packing in December of 1986 to go to Houston to join the faculty in family medicine, I unpacked a bunch of letters that had been in a pack that I had never opened. And one was from 1980, 81, and it was from Bob Rakel when he was chairman of the University of Iowa and who had invited me to interview for a position there. I thought the interview had gone well, but I never heard from him again. And here was this unopened envelope, and when I opened it, it said, "We all enjoyed your visit in Iowa City. We hope you'll come back soon for a second interview, and looks like we'd love to have you join the faculty here." And here it was, 6 years later, I was joining the faculty at Baylor College of Medicine.